today. I am particularly delighted to have Dr. James Anderson on the Hank Unplugged podcast. He is a professor of theology and philosophy at Reformed Theological Seminary. He received his PhD in philosophical theology from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And prior to pursuing theological studies, Dr. Anderson earned his first PhD in computer simulation from the University of Edinburgh. He is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers, the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, and the Evangelical Philosophical Society. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is the whole issue of worldview. You have an interactive approach to life's big questions. It's one of your books. So the question is, what are worldviews, and why do worldviews actually matter?
Right. So I define a worldview as a basic perspective on the world. I mean, the word itself gives you the clue. A worldview is a view of the world, but it's not a physical view like you might get from the International Space Station. It's not a view of planet Earth. It's a philosophical outlook on all of life and all of experience. And everyone has, I think, a worldview. They may not be aware of it. It's rather like the atmosphere around you or the air that you breathe. You just take it for granted, but in fact you couldn't live without it. And so people have a worldview, a set of basic assumptions or presuppositions about what exists, what is rational, what is probable, what is normal, and they could pick up this worldview in a number of ways. They might inherit it from their parents, from their community, or they might change their worldview over time. But it's a framework that they are bringing to interpret the world, and that means no one really comes to the world in a neutral way. That's not to say that we can't attain some level of objectivity, but everybody has a bias. It's a built-in bias. It's the worldview that we have. And so I think when we're considering Christian apologetics or anything else for that matter, one of the most important questions we have to ask is, what is the worldview that people are bringing to this issue? And then another question is going to be, is it the right worldview?
Yeah, so, one of the things I loved about your book is, and again, I'm talking about What's Your Worldview, an interactive approach to life's big questions, and the operative word there for me is interactive. You have a heuristic, interactive series of questions and answers. There's an algorithm to the book. It's fun and interactive. I want to talk about that first, the design of the book. Why not just write in a stuffy style? Why make this fun?
Yeah, so I wanted to write a book that would help people to become more aware of their worldview and to think more critically about their worldview. And one way to do it would be to just write a straight book that goes through major worldviews, something like James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door, which is an excellent book, but it sort of goes through 6 or 7 major worldviews. But I wanted something that was going to be a little snappier, and perhaps a little novel, have a sort of a gimmick to draw people in. And I drew partly on my computer science background because
I knew it.
Right, yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, so in computer science, one of the things you do as a programmer is you sort of have if-then statements. So if such and such a condition is true, then this, otherwise that. You just work on a sort of basis of binary conditionals and tree structures. And this was part and parcel of the work I was doing in computer science. And I for better or for worse, I brought that into my philosophy and my apologetics. And I was thinking, well, if you took the full range of worldviews and you arranged them as a tree structure, so you first perhaps distinguished theistic and non-theistic worldviews, and then each of those breaks down into different categories. What would be the best way to do it? How would you divide up the landscape of worldviews? So that was one thing I was bringing to it. The other thing was, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there was a very popular series of books known as Choose Your Own Adventure books. And they were interactive books. Instead of just reading from start to finish and getting the same story every time. You got to make choices. You got to decide whether you are going to go through the left door or through the right door, and you go to a different page depending on what decision you make, and there are different outcomes. And the fun of the book was that you could change your decision. So if you decided you made a bad choice, you could just turn back the page and make a different choice and follow the story through to a different ending. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting model to put into this book. Instead of a choose-your-own adventure, it would be a choose-your-own worldview, except you're not actually choosing it. You already have one. It's just a matter of identifying what that worldview is. But in the same way as the choose-your-own adventure, some outcomes are better than others. So, you make the wrong decision with the green goblin that you encounter, and you end up dead. So you made a bad choice. Likewise, when it comes to worldviews, if you have a worldview that denies the existence of truth or denies the existence of objective morality or implies that we can't actually know anything about the world, there are various kind of worldviews that are dead ends in the sense that they lead to skepticism, to futility, to nihilism, and there are various other problems as well. So that was the basic idea behind the book, and I don't know whether I was fully successful in pulling it off, but I was reasonably happy with the outcome.
I'll give you an A+. You mentioned a couple of times the word change, and that brings up the operative question: can we really change the worldview of another person?
That is a good question. I think we can challenge the worldview of a person, but human beings are not logic machines, much as some of us might like them to be, that they just perfectly process the logic of a worldview and follow through its consequences. Human beings are a mess of not only thoughts and logical ideas, but also emotions, desires, and people are very psychologically and emotionally invested in their worldview. Perhaps for them, the primary consideration is not, is my worldview true or rational, but is my worldview one that is popular, the one that makes me happy, one that allows me to live with this community that I've always associated with. So when you challenge a person's worldview, certainly you can challenge it on a rational basis, but there's always going to be resistance. I've sometimes likened worldviews to houses, in that you live in a house, you get used to it. You get comfortable with it. You might decorate it. You might make some minor changes, move the furniture around. But to actually ask someone to leave their home and relocate and live somewhere else, that's a big deal. They're going to have a lot of motivation to do that. And it's kind of like that with worldviews. There's this natural inertia or resistance to change, and we can do our best to challenge people's worldviews, to put a pebble in their shoe, as we sometimes say. But when we're talking about the kind of worldview change that a conversion to Christ involves, that's not just intellectual. That's spiritual. That's a change in the very soul and heart of a person. And we can't do that. We can be agents of the Holy Spirit, but ultimately it's a work of the Holy Spirit that's going to bring about that change.
I've often talked on the Bible Answer Man broadcast about Dr. Alex Rosenberg. He is a professor of philosophy. He's also a co-director of the Duke Center for Philosophy of Biology. And he points out to his students and an ever-burgeoning audience, what is the purpose of the universe? And then he gives us an answer. There is no purpose to the universe. In a world where physics fixes all the facts, it's hard to see how there could be any room for moral facts. Why? Because if Darwinism is true, then anything goes. And says Dr. Rosenberg, we have to face the fact that nihilism is true. There are no intrinsic moral values. And because there is no meaning, because there's no purpose, no immortality, no immorality, no moral compass, no free will, he counsels the scientistic, not the scientific, but the scientistic, to cultivate an Epicurean detachment. So if it gives you pleasure, whatever it is, it's morally good. Well, pain is unredeemable. And as for punishment, no one does wrong freely. There is no free will, so no one should be, well, punished for what they do. And he says, if all of that keeps you from sleeping at night, well, take some Prozac. And if that doesn't work, take some more. Keep taking them until it kicks in. And I think the first thing we ought to say about him is that he is an honest atheist. I mean, he's bit the bullet. He's bit the bullet in the sense of drawing to their logical conclusions the paradigms that he is promoting.
Yeah, he is. He's the best kind of atheist, if we can put it in those terms, in that he's an honest atheist and a consistent atheist. I think you said something a moment ago about that I did a good job with the critique of his book. Well, the reality is he provided all the ingredients for the critique. You know, the critique was in the book itself because so many of his claims were obviously counter to common sense and self-defeating. So it's just a matter of joining the dots to show how the worldview that he is advocating is radically self-defeating. But yeah, he's honest. He's challenged his fellow atheists to say, if you're going to be an atheist, then you've got to be a materialist or a naturalist. You have to be absolutely committed to a particular scientific or rather scientistic worldview, and you've got to follow through all the implications. And the implications are that there are no moral values. Interestingly, he says not even relative morality. He certainly rejects moral absolutism. He says moral relativism isn't an option either. The only option is moral nihilism. There really is nothing right or wrong. He denies that our mental life is really to be taken seriously. I mean, he's a sort of physicalist about the brain and denies the efficacy of mind. There's no meaning, there's no purpose. Yeah, he spells it all out. And guys like this, I think, are a gift to Christian apologetics.